It's a beautiful Tuesday afternoon when you realize you've gone to war. My weapon wasn't a gun or a sword. It was a pair of 12 000-watt Klieg lights powered by a generator the size of a smart car. And my enemy wasn't some foreign power or corporate behemoth. It was Carol Peterson from number 42, a woman who weaponized the color beige and wielded a homeowners association bylaws binder like a battle axe. It all started, as most suburban conflicts do, over something incredibly stupid. In this case, it was a box of rescue flares. And it ended with a cul-de-sac so bright you could see it from space, all because Carol made one critical mistake. She hid them. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have known what an HOA even was. Life was simple. I lived in a cramped city apartment where the only rule was, don't die in the hallway because it spooks the other tenants. But then my grandfather passed away, and his will left me with 2 things: his collection of slightly unsettling garden gnomes and a 2-story house in a place called Pleasant Meadows. The name alone should have been a red flag. Pleasant places are never actually pleasant. They're just places where everyone has agreed to pretend. The house itself was great, solid, spacious, with a backyard that didn't double as a fire escape. The problem was everything outside the property line. Pleasant Meadows wasn't a neighborhood. It was a science experiment in enforced conformity. Every lawn was a perfect, uniform carpet of emerald green, mowed to a regulation height that I was sure was specified somewhere in city code. Every house was painted one of 3 pre-approved shades of beige: aggressive almond, passive putty, or existential crisis ecru. Every mailbox was identical. It was the kind of place that looked like the architect just copy-pasted the same building a few dozen times and called it a day. I was trying to decide whether to cash out and move back to the glorious anonymity of the city or to embrace the quiet life. As part of my due diligence, I'd unearthed a document that had been left on the kitchen counter, tucked under a welcome basket containing oatmeal cookies and a passive-aggressive note about recycling bin placement. It was a 3-inch binder, stark white, with gold lettering on the spine. PMHOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I flipped it open out of morbid curiosity. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic nonsense. Article 4 forbade any lawn ornament not explicitly approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Article 7 had a whole subsection on holiday decoration timelines, specifying that inflatable Santas could not be erected before the 1st of December and must be deflated no later than January 5th. There were rules about the color of your front door, the type of mulch you could use, the maximum height of a shrub. It was a tyrannical manifesto for people with too much time on their hands. Laughing, I closed the binder and decided it would make an excellent monitor stand. It was the perfect height. My first real-life sighting of the HOA in action came a few days later. I was staring out my home office window, procrastinating on a project, when I saw her. A woman in her late 50s, with a blonde helmet of hair that looked like it could deflect small arms fire, was crouched on my next-door neighbor's lawn. She was wearing a pastel pink polo shirt, blindingly white tennis shoes, and a visor that looked like a portable awning. In her hand, she held a tape measure, which she was using to determine the height of a single, offending dandelion. After a moment of intense measurement, she made a furious note on a clipboard, shot the dandelion a look of pure hatred, and marched away. This, I would soon learn, was Carol Peterson, president of the Pleasant Meadows HOA, and my soon-to-be nemesis. At the time, I just thought she was a particularly dedicated gardener. I internally nicknamed her the Beige Dictator and went back to work, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering just beyond my perfectly manicured and soon-to-be-contested front lawn. My life wasn't all corporate drudgery and observations of suburban weirdness. On the weekends, I traded my ergonomic chair for a pair of hiking boots and a ridiculously heavy backpack. I was a volunteer for the county's search and rescue team. It was my escape. Out in the woods, the only rules were don't get eaten by a bear and make sure you can find your way back. It was a refreshing change of pace. Plus, we got to play with cool gear. Which brings me to the flares. We'd just gotten a new batch of high-intensity rescue flares, the kind that burn with the heat of 1,000 suns and can be seen from a helicopter through a canopy of trees. They were serious business. My team lead, a burly ex-Marine named Mike, had given me a case of 12. "Alex," he'd said, "take these. Pop 1 or 2 before the big training exercise this weekend. Make sure they're not duds. Find a safe spot, you know the drill. Don't burn down the county." So, on a bright, quiet Tuesday afternoon, I decided my cul-de-sac was the perfect safe spot. Nobody was around. The street was wide. I had a fire extinguisher right by the door. What could possibly go wrong? I grabbed the case of flares and my phone and called my SAR buddy, Dave, to get a second opinion. "You're gonna light a rescue flare in that Stepford Wife neighborhood?" Dave's voice crackled through the speaker, laced with amusement. "They're gonna think it's the Rapture, or a gender reveal party gone horribly wrong." "Come on, it's 2 o'clock on a Tuesday," I argued, walking out onto my front porch. "The entire population is either at work or at a Pilates class. I'll be quick. Set it up in the street, pop the cap, let it burn for 30 seconds, douse it. It's for public safety, man. I'm practically a hero." I could hear him snickering. "A hero, right? Just try not to set fire to the prize-winning petunias of whatever she-demon runs your HOA. I hear those suburban warlords are no joke." "She-demon? I think I saw her measuring a dandelion yesterday. I'll be fine," I said, my confidence far higher than it had any right to be. "It's one flare. How much trouble can one little flare cause?" Famous last words. I hung up the phone, feeling a sense of civic duty. I was testing life-saving equipment. I was a responsible member of the community, ensuring the tools of my volunteer trade were in working order. I was a good guy. Carol Peterson, however, did not see it that way. She saw a rule, and that rule was about to be flagrantly, incandescently violated. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to walk into an ambush. I chose my spot carefully, in the middle of the asphalt cul-de-sac, equidistant from my driveway and my neighbor's prize-winning, and probably regulated, rose bushes. I brought out the essentials: 1 crimson-red flare, a heavy-duty fire extinguisher from my garage, and a 5-gallon bucket of water, just in case. Overkill? Absolutely. But SR training drills into you a certain level of paranoia they call preparedness. I knelt, set the flare on its little cardboard stand, and checked for traffic. The only movement was a plastic bag skittering across a lawn 2 houses down, an infraction that I was sure was punishable by public shaming in the community newsletter. It was all clear. I took the striker cap off the flare, ready to create a controlled, brief, and very bright burst of light for the noble cause of rescue readiness. "Excuse me?" The voice was sharp, cutting through the suburban silence like a shard of glass. I looked up. It was her, the beige dictator. Carol had materialized on the curb, seemingly out of thin air. She had her hands on her hips, and her visor was angled at a degree that could only be described as accusatory. "Oh, hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just testing a piece of safety equipment. I'll be done in 30 seconds. "What do you think you're doing?" she asked, ignoring my explanation entirely. Her eyes were locked on the flare like it was a live cobra. "Like I said, it's a rescue flare, for my search and rescue team. Just making sure it works." Article 7, Section 4B of the Pleasant Meadows Bylaws expressly forbids the discharge of pyrotechnics, incendiary devices, or non-approved recreational fires. She recited the rule from memory, her voice devoid of any warmth or understanding. It was the voice of a speaking clock that had gained sentience and a lust for power. I blinked. This isn't a firework, and it's definitely not for recreation. It's for, you know, rescuing people, finding lost hikers, that sort of thing." "It looks like a firework to me," she declared, taking a step closer. "A very dangerous, non-compliant firework. The kind that leaves scorch marks on our community-funded asphalt. I'm going to have to ask you to stop." A part of me wanted to argue. A bigger part of me just wanted to avoid the headache. I wasn't in the mood for a fight with a woman who probably had the entire HOA binder memorized. "Fine, okay, no problem," I sighed, standing up and dusting off my knees. I picked up the unlit flare and the rest of my gear. "I'll go test it somewhere else. Sorry to bother you." I thought that was the end of it. I had complied. I had de-escalated. I had chosen peace. I walked back to my porch, put the flare back in its cardboard box with its 11 brethren, and left the box near my front door, planning to move it to my car in a few minutes. I had a work call to jump on. It was a fatal error. In the quiet, beige battlefields of Pleasant Meadows, compliance is not seen as peace. It's seen as a weakness to be exploited. The work call was a soul-crushing affair about synergy and leveraging core competencies that ran, as they always do, about 45 minutes longer than necessary. By the time I escaped and went to grab the box of flares from my porch, the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, except the box wasn't there. I stood on my welcome mat, a plain brown one, thankfully compliant, and stared at the empty space where the box had been. My first thought was that I'd already moved it. I checked my garage. Nothing. I checked the trunk of my car. Nothing. I went back to the porch and looked again, as if it might magically reappear. It was definitely gone. That's when I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible drag mark in the dark brown mulch of my flower bed. It started at the edge of my porch and traced a clear path across my lawn, over the pristine property line, and ended near a set of 3 large matching beige yard waste bins next to Carol's house. The bins were closed. One of them had a shiny new padlock on it. My brain took a few seconds to process the sheer audacity of it. She hadn't just told me to stop. She had waited until my back was turned, trespassed onto my property, and stolen a box of official, county-owned search and rescue equipment. My annoyance quickly curdled into a hot, simmering rage. This wasn't about a bylaw anymore. This was theft. I marched across my lawn and pounded on her front door. It took a moment, but it eventually swung open to reveal Carol, holding a glass of iced tea and wearing a beatific smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. "Alex," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "Can I help you?" "Carol, did you happen to see a cardboard box on my porch? About yay high?" I asked, keeping my voice as level as I could. "I saw a box of dangerous, non-compliant incendiaries, yes," she replied, without a hint of shame. "I took the liberty of securing them. Per Article 9, Section 1 of the Covenants, the HOA has the right to remove any hazardous materials left in public view for the safety of the community." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "That's my front porch. It's not public view. And they're not hazardous, they're rescue equipment. I need those for a SR training exercise this weekend. They're county property, Carol. You can't just take them." Her smile widened. It was a terrifying sight. "They are being held in a secure location pending a formal review. You can file a petition to have them returned after the next quarterly board meeting, which is in 2 months. The forms are available for download on the community website. Have a pleasant day." And with that, she closed the door in my face. The soft click of the lock echoed in the silent cul-de-sac. I stood there on her perfectly edged walkway, vibrating with a level of fury I hadn't felt since my internet went out during the Game of Thrones finale. She hadn't just beaten me. She had used the bureaucratic machinery of the HOA to completely neutralize me. She had followed the rules, her rules, to commit a crime. I walked back to my own house in a daze. The rage was still there, but it was being joined by something else. A cold, clear, and wonderfully petty sense of purpose. She wanted to play by the book? Fine. I'd play by the book. Her book. I sat down in my office, pulled the 3-inch binder out from under my monitor, and began to read. A sly, malicious grin spread across my face. My war with Carol Peterson had just begun, and I was about to go nuclear. For the next 2 hours, I read. I didn't skim. I devoured that HOA binder with the intensity of a law student cramming for the bar exam. I read about fence heights and paint finishes and the proper procedure for reporting a neighbor whose wind chimes were deemed excessively melodic. I learned that I couldn't park a commercial vehicle in my driveway. I couldn't let my dog bark for more than 10 consecutive minutes, and I absolutely, under no circumstances, could erect a flamingo of any kind on my lawn. But as I flipped through page after page of petty restrictions, I noticed what wasn't there. There were dozens of rules about fire. Open flames, fire pits, fireworks, even tiki torches were all heavily regulated. There were rules about noise, covering everything from power tools to late-night parties. But there was nothing, absolutely nothing, about light. A glorious, beautiful, magnificent loophole. My fingers flew across the keyboard. My search history, which moments before was filled with how to legally reclaim stolen property from a neighbor, now looked very different. Industrial lighting rental near me. Movie set lighting specifications. How bright is a stadium floodlight? Maximum wattage for residential generator. A plan began to form. A beautiful symphony of malicious compliance and theatrical revenge. I grabbed my phone and started making calls. The first call was to a company called Event Rentals Pro. A slick-sounding guy named Chad answered. "Hey, I need to rent some lights," I said. "You got it," Chad chirped. "Wedding? Corporate event? We do it all. Uplighting, string lights, monogram projections." "I'm thinking bigger," I cut in. "I need to light up my front yard. I want it to look like daytime. At night." There was a pause. "Like, for a movie shoot?" "No, just for ambiance." "Sir," Chad said, his voice losing its chipper edge, "our daylight package involves multiple 18,000-watt HMI fixtures. They can simulate the surface of the sun. They're not for ambiance." I thanked him and hung up. The second call was to a construction supply company. The guy who answered sounded like he'd been gargling gravel. "Yeah? Hi. I was wondering about renting some light towers, the kind you use for night construction on the highway." "Got 'em. Diesel generator, 4,000 watts a bulb. How many you need?" "Just 2 should do it. What's the rental process?" "Gotta have a commercial account and proof of insurance." Strike 2. I was starting to feel discouraged when I found a listing for Frank's Film and Event Lighting. It had a grainy photo of a grizzled-looking older guy leaning against a truck. He looked like he'd seen it all. I dialed the number. "Frank's," a voice grumbled. "Hi, I have a weird request," I began. I explained my situation. The need for overwhelming, legally permissible light. I didn't give him the whole story, just that I needed to seriously illuminate my property for a couple of days. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the million-dollar question. "Let me get this straight, kid. You want me to bring 212,000-watt Klieg lights, the kind we use to light up skyscrapers for movie premieres, and put them on towers in your suburban front yard?" That's the basic idea, yes. "And this isn't for a film or a party?" I hesitated, then decided to go with the truth. "It's because my neighbor, the HOA president, stole my search and rescue road flares and is holding them hostage." There was a long, silent pause, on the other end of the line. I thought he'd hung up. Then I heard a low chuckle, which grew into a wheezing, gut-busting laugh. "She did what?" he roared. "She didn't steal them," I clarified, a grin spreading across my face. "She secured them for the safety of the community." Frank howled with laughter. It was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. "Oh, that's rich, kid, I love it, I'm in. But it's gonna cost you, and your power bill's gonna look like a phone number." "Frank," I said, my voice filled with newfound purpose, "some things are priceless. When can you start?" "I can have my guys out there tomorrow afternoon," he said, still chuckling. "Operation Daylight is a go." The next afternoon, just as the neighborhood kids were getting off the school bus, Frank's truck rumbled down my street. It was a glorious sight. The truck was a beat-up Ford F-350, and it was towing a flatbed trailer loaded with what looked like disassembled pieces of a moon lander. Metal trusses, giant spools of thick black cable, and 2 light fixtures the size of satellite dishes gleamed in the afternoon sun. Frank hopped out, looking exactly like his picture. Grizzled, with a friendly, mischievous glint in his eye. With him were 2 younger guys, his crew, who looked at my beige, boring house with a mixture of confusion and excitement. "This is the place?" one of them, a lanky kid named Jake, asked. "This is the place," Frank confirmed, clapping me on the back. "All right, boys, let's get Project Blinding Justice underway." As they started unloading, the neighborhood's finely tuned weirdness detection system went into overdrive. Curtains twitched. A few people who were pretending to garden suddenly became very interested in the weeds closest to my property line. And then, right on cue, the final boss emerged. Carol strode across her lawn, clipboard in hand, her face a thundercloud of righteous indignation. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, gesturing to the mountain of industrial equipment on my driveway. "That junk violates at least a dozen aesthetic ordinances." I was ready for her. I held up my copy of the HOA binder, a bookmark clearly visible in Article 12. "Actually, it doesn't, Carol," I said, my voice dripping with the smarmy satisfaction of a C student who finally aced a test. Article 12, Section 3, covers temporary structures. And as these are being professionally installed for a private event and will be professionally removed in less than 48 hours, they fall under the rental exemption. No architectural review committee approval required. Carol's mouth opened and closed like a fish. She was momentarily stunned. Frank, bless his heart, stepped forward, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Ma'am," he said with a completely straight face, "we're fully licensed and insured. Just setting up some decorative lighting for the homeowner's private event." Her eyes narrowed. "What event?" "A personal celebration," I improvised. "Of my right to private property and proper lighting." She stared at me, then at the massive light fixtures, then back at me. She knew she was being played, but she was trapped by the very rules she worshipped. Powerless to stop the installation, she retreated to her front porch, where she sat in a rocking chair, watching our every move and no doubt documenting it all on her clipboard. Frank's crew was amazing. They worked with the cheerful efficiency of men who were deeply invested in the pettiness of the mission. They assembled the 2 metal towers, each one standing about 15 feet tall. They mounted the Klieg lights. They ran thick, python-like cables from the lights to a large, surprisingly quiet generator they placed near the side of my house. The whole time, they were cracking jokes. "You think this is bright enough to see from her living room?" Jake asked as he tightened a bolt. "Jake, I think this is bright enough for her to see her ancestors," Frank grunted back. They aimed the lights with surgical precision, not directly at her house, which could be a legal issue. Instead, they were aimed to cross in the middle of the street, perfectly illuminating the asphalt in front of my house while also creating a massive, unavoidable splash of light that would engulf the entire front of her property, including her pristine bay window. It was a work of art. By late afternoon, the work was done. The two towers stood like metallic sentinels on my front lawn, their giant glass eyes aimed and ready. Frank did a final check on the generator, then walked over to me, holding a small black remote with a single large candy-like red button. "She's all yours, kid," he said, pressing the remote into my hand. "Generator's got a remote start. Just press the big red button. It'll take a second to warm up, but then... well, you'll see." He looked over at Carol's house, where her silhouette was still visible, watching us from her porch. "Give her hell." Frank and his crew packed up their tools and drove off, giving me a thumbs up as their truck disappeared around the corner. "Call us in 48 hours, Jake yelled from the passenger window. "Or if you need to report an alien landing." I waited. The anticipation was exquisite. I watched as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The automated streetlights of Pleasant Meadows flickered on, casting their weak, yellow pools of light onto the perfect sidewalks. I went inside, made a sandwich, and sat down in my living room, watching the window of Carol's house. I saw her move from the porch to her living room, the faint blue light of a television screen illuminating her. The time was 7:29 p.m. It was getting dark. It was time. I walked out onto my own front porch, sat down in a lawn chair, and put on a pair of sunglasses. My heart was pounding with a giddy mix of anxiety and pure, unadulterated glee. I took a deep, theatrical breath, savored the moment of perfect, quiet suburban twilight, and pressed the big red button. For a second, nothing happened. Then, from the side of my house, the generator coughed to life with a low, powerful roar, surprisingly quiet, like a high-end European sports car idling. The filaments inside the two massive Klieg lights began to glow, first a dull orange, then a brighter yellow, and then... Foom. The world didn't just get brighter. It ceased to be night. The light was a physical force. It was a biblical revelation-level event. It was a clean, pure, white light, so intense it felt solid. It slammed into the street, the houses, the trees, and erased every shadow. My beige house was suddenly a glowing, incandescent beacon. My neighbor's lawn became a surreal, hyper-green landscape from another planet. And Carol's house was lit up like the grand finale of a 4th of July fireworks show. Every speck of dust on her windows, every blade of grass in her lawn, every tiny imperfection in her passive putty paint job was exposed in unforgiving, high-definition glory. A shriek pierced the air from inside her house. A moment later, her front door flew open. Carol stumbled out onto her porch, wearing what looked like a silk nightgown, one hand shielding her eyes. "What? What is that? Who? You can't!" she screeched, her voice cracking. I didn't move from my lawn chair. I calmly turned a page in the book I had brought out with me. I looked up over the top of my sunglasses, giving her a polite, neighborly smile. "Evening, Carol," I said, my voice carrying easily in the suddenly silent cul-de-sac. "Lovely night for it, isn't it? Just decided to get some reading done. You know, they say reading in dim light is bad for your eyes. Can't be too careful." She just stood there, sputtering, a silhouette of pure rage against the backdrop of her own illuminated house. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Instead, she spun around, ran back inside, and I could just make out the furious, stabbing motions of her finger dialing her phone. The next act of our little play was about to begin. The wait wasn't long. In less than 5 minutes, I saw the flashing red and blue lights approaching. It was a comical sight. The police cruiser's emergency lights, designed to command attention and cut through darkness, were completely washed out by the overwhelming glare emanating from my lawn. They looked like pathetic little birthday candles in the face of a forest fire. The squad car slowed to a crawl as it entered the cul-de-sac. The two officers inside leaning forward, squinting through the windshield as if they were driving into the heart of a supernova. The car stopped directly in the brightest part of the beam, and two officers got out, their hands instinctively going up to shield their eyes. They looked less like officers of the law and more like lost astronauts who had taken a wrong turn at Alpha Centauri. One was older, with a thick mustache, and a belly that spoke of a long and storied relationship with donuts. The other was younger, taller, and looked like he was desperately trying not to laugh. They walked towards me, their boots crunching on the unnaturally bright driveway. "Evening, officers," I said calmly from my chair. The older one, whose name tag read Miller, stopped about 10 feet away. He lowered his hand slightly, squinting. "Sir," he began, his voice a gravelly monotone of pure, professional weariness. "I'm going to need you to do me a favor. Can you please tell me why your house has entered the sun?" "Just getting a little nighttime reading done," I replied, holding up my book. "Also, staging a small, well-lit protest over the theft of my county-issued search and rescue equipment." Just then, Carol's door burst open again. She stormed across her lawn and practically skidded to a halt next to the officers. She had thrown a cardigan over her nightgown, but her hair was askew, and her face was a mask of fury. "Thank God you're here, officers!" she squawked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Arrest him! He's violating everything! The bylaws, public nuisance, light pollution, my retinas, he's a menace!" Officer Miller turned his head slowly to face her. "Ma'am, please calm down. Start from the beginning." For the next 5 minutes, Carol launched into a frantic, high-pitched, and slightly unhinged tirade. She talked about bylaws and ordinances, about my provocative attitude, and the flagrant discharge of pyrotechnics. She waved her arms, she paced. She sounded like a conspiracy theorist explaining chemtrails. When she finally paused to take a breath, Officer Miller turned his gaze back to me. The younger officer, Davis, was now biting his lip, his shoulders shaking slightly. "Son," Miller said, his voice dangerously calm. "You want to give me your version?" I stood up, took off my sunglasses, and walked towards them. I explained my side of the story calmly and logically. I told them I was a volunteer for the county SAR team. I explained that I needed to test my equipment. I told them how Carol had ordered me to stop, and how she had then come onto my property and taken the case of flares, refusing to return them. "She admitted it," I said. "Told me I could file a petition to get them back in 2 months. They're official county property, officers. I need them for a state-mandated training this weekend." I then produced my SAR identification from my wallet and handed it to him. Miller examined the ID. He looked at Davis. He looked at Carol. "Ma'am," Officer Davis said, finally speaking up, his voice professionally flat, but with an undeniable undercurrent of amusement. "Did you take this man's property from his porch?" "I was securing it," Carol insisted. "It was a community hazard. It's in the bylaws." "Ma'am, the HOA bylaws are a civil matter. What you're describing sounds an awful lot like theft of property," Miller said, handing my ID back. He then turned to me. "Son, are you breaking any laws here? Is that generator over the city's noise ordinance limit?" "No, sir," I said, already prepared. "It's a new inverter model. Runs at 53 decibels. Well under the 65 decibel limit for residential areas after 7 p.m. I have the spec sheet if you'd like to see it." Miller's mustache twitched. "And the lights? There's no law against being this bright?" "No, sir," I said. "I checked. The city ordinance only prohibits flashing or strobing lights, and lights that directly impede the vision of drivers on a public roadway." As you can see, the beams are angled down at the street in front of my house. They're not flashing, and they aren't pointed down the road." I paused for effect. They are, however, pointed somewhat in the direction of her house. There was a long, heavy silence, punctuated only by the hum of the generator. Carol looked like she was about to have an aneurysm. Officer Davis coughed, a sound that was suspiciously close to a snort of laughter. Officer Miller sighed, the sound of a man who had seen too much and was paid too little. He looked at Carol. "Ma'am, this is an HOA dispute. It's a civil matter. He isn't breaking any laws that we can see. There's nothing we can do." "Nothing?" she shrieked. "My taxes pay your salary. You have to do something." "What I'd suggest," Miller said, his voice dropping an octave, "is that you return the man's property. Immediately. Have a good night." He and Davis turned, got back in their cruiser, and slowly drove away. As the car turned the corner, I could have sworn I saw both of their silhouettes shaking with laughter. Carol and I were left standing in the silent, impossibly bright cul-de-sac. She stared at me, her face a portrait of utter defeat and pure, undiluted hatred. Her reign of terror had been met with overwhelming, legally sound force, and the authorities had just sided with the rebel. Without another word, she spun on her heel, marched back into her house, and slammed the door. 10 minutes later, her front door cracked open. A cardboard box was unceremoniously shoved out onto her porch, followed by a swift kick that sent it tumbling onto her lawn. I smiled. I walked over to the remote, which was still sitting on my book. I pressed the big red button. The generator sputtered and died. The lights faded instantly. The world was plunged back into a shocking, profound darkness, broken only by the feeble glow of the streetlights. Victory was sweet, and it was very, very bright. I should have known that a creature like Carol Peterson wouldn't surrender after losing a single battle. I had won the Battle of the Flares, but the war for Pleasant Meadows had just begun. She had been publicly humiliated. The police, her presumed allies in the fight for ultimate order, had laughed in her face. Her power had been challenged. Now she was going to use the one weapon she had left: the full, crushing, bureaucratic weight of the HOA. The retaliation started the very next morning. Taped to my front door was a crisp beige envelope. Inside was an official notice of violation. My crime? My lawn, according to the notice, exceeded the maximum regulation height of 4 inches by approximately 1/4 of an inch in 3 separate documented locations. A fine of $25 was assessed. The notice included grainy, zoomed-in photos of the offending blades of grass. It was laughably petty. I paid the fine and mowed the lawn that afternoon. The next day, another beige envelope arrived. Violation. A single, minuscule dandelion had been spotted erupting from a flower bed near my driveway. Fine. $25. The day after that. Violation. Garbage and recycling receptacles were still visible from the street at 9:31 a.m. on pickup day. A full 31 minutes past the mandated 9 a.m. removal time. Fine. $50. It was a death by 1,000 paper cuts. Each day brought a new, inventive, and utterly insane infraction. My welcome mat was apparently made of a non-approved fibrous material. The small, decorative flag for my favorite football team that I'd stuck in a potted plant was an unauthorized banner. The paint on my mailbox was found to be faded to a degree inconsistent with community standards. I was drowning in fines. I sent polite, carefully worded emails to the HOA board, appealing the violations. They were met with automated responses or curt dismissals signed by the board, but I knew it was all Carol. She had turned the HOA into her personal slingshot, and I was the giant she was trying to take down with a barrage of pebbles. My frustration was boiling over. One Saturday, as I was on my hands and knees pulling a microscopic weed that I was sure Carol had planted herself in the dead of night, my neighbor from across the street, a kindly retired man named Bob, wandered over. "Getting you too, huh?" he asked, gesturing to the beige notice I had crumpled in my hand. "Bob, it's insane," I vented. "Yesterday I got fined because a delivery driver left a package on my porch that was, and I quote, not aesthetically aligned with the front entrance." Bob chuckled sadly. "That's Carol for you. Last month I got a $75 fine because my garden gnome's hat was deemed excessively conical. Been living here 20 years. It's never been this bad." Just then, a young woman pushing a stroller, Maria from 2 doors down, walked by and overheard us. "Are you guys talking about the notices?" she asked, her voice tired. "I just got one for unauthorized playground equipment. It's a turtle-shaped sandbox, for God's sake. For my daughter. My application to the architectural committee was denied because the shade of green wasn't on the approved palette." A spark ignited in my mind. I wasn't alone. The entire neighborhood was living under this petty tyranny. Carol hadn't just declared war on me. She was at war with anyone who dared to live a life that was slightly more vibrant than the color beige. "We can't fight this one by one," I said, a new plan forming. "She's picking us off. But the bylaws, they're her power. But they can be our weapon too." Bob and Maria looked at me, intrigued. "What are you thinking?" Bob asked. "I'm thinking," I said, a familiar malicious grin returning to my face. "It's time for a regime change. She loves to govern by the book. So let's use the book to fire the governor." I invited them inside and for the first time pulled the HOA binder out from under my monitor, not as a tool for revenge, but as a blueprint for a revolution. The Pleasant Meadows quarterly HOA meeting was an event usually attended by the 5 board members, Carol and her 4 loyal, equally miserable cronies, and maybe one confused new resident who thought it was a potluck. It was held in the community center, a sad, windowless room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and broken dreams. This time it was different. When Carol and her board arrived, they found the room wasn't empty. It was packed. I was there. Bob was there. Maria was there, with her husband. At least 15 other homeowners, a veritable army of the disgruntled I had rallied over the past few weeks, were sitting in the cheap plastic chairs, waiting. The look of smug satisfaction on Carol's face faltered, replaced by a flicker of panic. She tried to proceed as normal, droning on about landscaping budgets and the upcoming community picnic. But when she got to the new business portion of the agenda, I stood up. "I have some new business I'd like to propose," I said, my voice clear and steady. Carol's eyes narrowed. "The floor is not open for—" "Actually, Carol, it is," I cut her off, holding up my well-worn copy of the binder. According to Robert's Rules of Order, which Article 2, Section 5 states are the governing procedures for these meetings, any homeowner can raise a point of new business during this time. And my first point is a motion to review potential conflicts of interest and covenant violations by the board members themselves. A murmur went through the room. Carol's face turned a shade of crimson that was definitely not on the approved color palette. I clicked a button on a small remote, and a projector I had set up earlier hummed to life, displaying a PowerPoint presentation on the wall. The title slide read, "The People vs. Carol Peterson, an audit of HOA governance." For the next 20 minutes, I laid out my case. I was calm, professional, and merciless. I used photos, dates, and direct quotes from the bylaws. Slide after slide detailed Carol's abuse of power. I showed pictures of Bob's gnome and Maria's sandbox. I presented a chart showing the exponential increase in fines over the last 6 months. Then, I turned the bylaws against her. Article 11 clearly states that any modification to a home's exterior, including the installation of satellite dishes, requires ARC approval, I said, clicking to the next slide. It was a picture of Carol's house, taken from a neighboring yard. A cleverly hidden, but definitely unapproved satellite dish was visible behind a large azalea bush. Gasps rippled through the room. Furthermore, I continued, Article 6 sets the maximum fence height at 6 feet, as Bob was kind enough to measure for us last Tuesday. I clicked again. The next slide showed Bob holding a tape measure against Carol's back fence. It was 6 feet, 2 inches high. I had her. She was a hypocrite, and I had the evidence. This isn't about grass height or the color of a sandbox, I concluded, turning to face the assembled homeowners. This is about the fair and equal application of the rules we all agree to live by. The current board leadership has used its power not to maintain community standards, but to harass and intimidate its neighbors. Therefore, I motion for a vote of no confidence in the current HOA president, Carol Peterson. Chaos erupted. Carol was sputtering, trying to rule my motion out of order, but Bob, who had also read the rules, stood up and seconded it. The motion was valid. It had to go to a vote. It was a landslide. One by one, the residents of Pleasant Meadows raised their hands to oust their beige dictator, 17-4. Carol and her cronies were the only ones who voted to keep her. She was speechless, utterly and completely defeated, not by light or by anger, but by her own beloved rules. A new vote was held immediately. Bob, despite his protests, was nominated and unanimously elected the new HOA president. His first act? A motion to review and dismiss all fines issued in the last 6 months. It passed without objection. The war was over. In the weeks that followed the great HOA coup, a strange and wonderful thing happened in Pleasant Meadows. It became pleasant. Bob was a reluctant but fair leader. The endless stream of beige envelopes stopped. The Architectural Review Committee, now staffed by reasonable human beings like Maria, approved the green turtle sandbox. Bob's gnome got a new, even more conical rainbow-colored hat, and nobody said a word. The neighborhood started to feel less like a prison camp and more like a community. People started talking to each other, laughing, no longer afraid of a citation for excessive neighborly fraternization. I decided to keep my grandfather's house. The quiet life, it turned out, wasn't so bad when it wasn't being micromanaged by a tyrant. As a gesture of goodwill, I even hired Frank, my co-conspirator in Operation Daylight, to install some tasteful, low-voltage landscape lighting along my front walkway. It was subtle, elegant, and most importantly, fully approved by the new board. Frank did it at a discount, calling it the Victor's Spoils package. I saw Carol every now and then. The power had drained out of her. She was just a quiet, grumpy neighbor now. One afternoon, I saw her loading groceries into her car at the local supermarket. She glanced up and saw me walking in. For a moment, our eyes met. A flash of the old hatred crossed her face, but it was weak, like a dying ember. She had no power over me anymore. I gave her a cheerful two-finger salute. "Morning, Carol," I called out across the parking lot. "Lovely day for it, isn't it?" She didn't respond. She just glared, slammed her trunk shut with unnecessary force, got in her car, and sped away, her tires squealing slightly. That evening, I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the quiet, when my phone rang. It was Dave. "So," he said, "you free for that big SAR training exercise this weekend? For real this time, we're doing a night navigation drill." I looked out at the peaceful cul-de-sac, at the soft glow of my new, compliant lights, and smiled. "Absolutely," I said. "I'll be there. And hey, if we get lost in the dark, don't worry." "Oh yeah?" Dave asked. "Why's that?" "Let's just say," I replied, leaning back in my chair, "I have an idea on how to light the place up.